football teams first. I think Jacksonville got swindled in the swapping of coaches. Because I think our coach came from Jacksonville. And vice versa. And our defensive coordinator came down here to be coach, and it just takes a little time for them to get together, but they sure seem to know what they're doing. We've stuck with Mike Smith 4 years, and it's working out. The thing about football is that it's sort of an analogy of life. You try something, and you get that knocked down, and then you get up and you try something else. And when you finally work out and get a team that everybody is working together on the same thing, all of a sudden it works. And I think that's a parable of what our great nation is all about. And I see this not just as an analogy and a direction of the past, but I think if we look at the lessons that we have learned in the last 450, 500 years, but for me, especially the last 50 years here in the South, that nobody could have ever imagined that we could have gone through the kind of social upheaval that we have gone through, destroying very little property and killing very few people. And the message of St. Augustine, for me, is that people can come together without violence, and they can work together, and they can overcome any of the obstacles. In fact, we can create a situation where our very diversity becomes our strength. And I say understanding that gives Viva, Florida, a vocation for the future, in addition to the celebration of the past. Now, because I have been in the business I've been in, and I should say I really didn't get locked up in Florida. They didn't put me in jail. They beat me up. But it was a policeman, a Florida policeman, Jimmy Petroglyph, whose wife later on became the mayor, who broke into the mob and pushed them aside, and I thank God that he, even then, was about 6'6" and 250 pounds. And he picked me up and put me on my feet and set me on my way. And the guys who were beating me up, I found out later on, were on an interracial softball team and had gone beyond the conflicts of 1963-64. And so we have something to celebrate in that the diversity that has been a challenge for us in America. And let's not gloss it over. It started with slavery. It started with the massacre of the native peoples. It started with a lot of problems, and it was a lot of righteous religious people. I mean, the Congregationalists, my denomination, didn't treat the Baptists and the Quakers very well, and none of them liked the Catholics. You know, we've been through everything in this country that the whole world is going through. And let me tell you how I see Viva Florida playing into the global situation. In China, I visited with the Office of National Minorities. And when he knew my background, he took me away from the delegation and wanted to talk to me in private. Interestingly enough, he was Chinese, but he was a Muslim. And he wanted to know how we got through the difficulties. And he said, we're concerned because you had 2 or 3 cultural clashes. We had more than that. But he said, we have 104 cultural nationalities. And the progress and prosperity of China is largely in one area. We've got to figure out, well, you got another 100 Tibets. We've got to figure out how to make one nation of 1,500,000,000 people out of this huge country of ours. And we really haven't figured out how. And they're being very oppressive about it. Well, we kind of went through that with South Africa. And the reason I had no problem dealing with South Africa was because the people that I grew up with in Louisiana were just like the people in South Africa. And I grew up in a neighborhood where there was an Irish grocery store on one corner, an Italian bar on another corner, and the Nazi Party was on the third corner, and they were Heil Hitler when I was 4 years old, 1936. And my father was a dentist, and many of his suppliers were Jewish, and all of my friends were Roman Catholic, and I was Protestant. The first fight I got into, Father, was over the Lord's Prayer. Because Catholics say it a little different than Protestants. So, I mean, I've been there. And we've been through all of the kinds of challenges, and we've worked them through in this country in a way that the rest of the world has still got to go. Japan didn't have much problem because they were pretty much a homogeneous nation. Korea is fairly the same, and they're doing very well, but Southern Africa has an enormously diverse population. We didn't realize in Iraq that the differences between Sunni and Shia and Kurds were far greater and far more bitter. They go back 1,500 years. And people are far more emotional about that than we ever were about race. And we, even in slavery, and even in our diversity, until just recently, we shared a Judeo-Christian heritage. And we were bound by the same values. And the Constitution was an outgrowth in itself of struggles. As a Congregationalist, I always kind of joke that John Adams, good Republican, thought that Thomas Jefferson was a spendthrift Democrat because he wasted money buying Louisiana territory and this swamp land down here in Florida. And he got cussed out up and down. And if you think that the political climate of our news media is vicious, go back and check the way they talked about Jefferson and Adams. And fortunately, though, there's always a wonderful, intelligent woman like Abigail Adams that kind of mediated the struggle, and we did it all in the context of democratic institutions, where we would get together and argue it out, and yes, cuss and fuss, and occasionally there was a duel, as with Hamilton and Burr, but for the most part, you can't leave out and ignore the Civil War. But that division killed more Americans than almost any other problem we've had. And we're still struggling with those divisions. But we're struggling, and we're struggling successfully. I have always tried to figure out how I got named Andrew Jackson. And then when we celebrated the 300th anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase, it suddenly dawned on me that in reading that my parents, grandparents, great-grandparents were slaves who came into New Orleans and evidently got land by volunteering to defend New Orleans against Napoleon. And that's the way Andrew Jackson put together his army. He got Native Americans, blacks, indentured servants who were white. He just got anybody who would fight and said, if you fight to protect New Orleans, there will be land. And so even before the Civil War, my ancestors had land down in the bayous of Louisiana, and somehow got educated by missionaries, Protestant and Catholic. And so the struggles we have been through. And then I realized that I'm Andrew Jackson. And so they named my father for the president who gave us the land. Now we're working on, we got Andrew Jackson Young the fourth. And so we started going back looking at all of this, and one of the things I realized that we got land to fight to defend New Orleans, and we never had to fight to defend New Orleans. We didn't have to fight to defend New Orleans because Napoleon got hung up with a bunch of slaves in Haiti, and a fellow by the name of Toussaint Louverture. And so I've always felt that my success, the prosperity of my family, the education and opportunity that we have enjoyed was in some sense at the expense of Haiti. And so one of the reasons I can't just retire and sit back and say I've had a good life and now I'm going to sleep. One of the problems is I never learned to play golf, or maybe I would. But there's so much in the world crying out for the experience that we have. There's almost no place that doesn't have to cope in the next 50 years the events that we have occurred in the last 50 years. Now, we were fairly successful in both the Carter administration and the Reagan administration in leading Southern Africa through a period of real anguish and potential violence and destruction and racial discord. And we worked out those differences. And we have a peaceful, prosperous Southern Africa now. In fact, 7 of the fastest growing 10 countries on the planet are on the African continent. And the estimate is, according to some economists, that if the growth rates continue, see, China and India have slowed down. Japan's in a recession too. Korea's doing pretty well though. But if you look at things globally, by 2025, the largest middle class on the planet could be on the African continent. But they're all split up. There are 53 African countries, not one China or one India. But the 53 African countries are 2 billion people. And so, looking at our future, I'm convinced that we are going to have to celebrate the lessons of this 500-year success story, with all of its problems, with all of its wounds, with all of its aches and pains, with all of the things that we still have to learn and still have to do, that we're going to have to celebrate this in such a way that we give hope to the rest of the world. Now that's a difficult challenge, because I brought the paper up here with me, and my friend Ross Perot says the U.S. is headed for disaster. And everybody, you know, right now is anxious, because we do have a global recession. There's no question about that. But I'm a poor boy who's gotten old, and I've been through many dangers, toils, and snares by God's amazing grace. So I don't get despairing and cynical. And I ran across an article in Forbes a few months ago that there's $21 to $30 trillion that's in offshore tax havens, in place where it's not doing any good. Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Bermuda, Holland, you know, but none of those are utilizing those trillions of dollars. $21 trillion is 3 times the economy of China. It's the economy of the United States and Japan put together. That's how much money has been taken out of the global economy. And I'm not fussing, and I'm not preaching, and I'm not being political. People made money and got scared. They didn't know what to do with it. The world was in such turmoil. Where do you invest it? How do you invest it? Well, when I became mayor, we kind of figured that out, because I'd been on the banking committee and at the UN before I got elected, and we knew that there was $500 billion in oil money around. So we created tax-exempt municipal bonds. And that's the way we built our airport. That's the way we built our industrial zones. We invited people to come and invest with us. Well, they invested 10, maybe $15 billion in our airport. It doesn't bother us. Nobody really complains because they made 6% on it tax exempt. It created 435,000 jobs, and it earns $58 billion every year. So everybody's happy. What I'm saying is we found a way to make free enterprise and democracy work for everybody. And that's what you do in Florida. And that's what you symbolize in your football games and in your celebrations. I just go back and never forget the lessons of our native ancestors. When I went to the UN, the chiefs of the Mohawk nations came to me and they said, we have only one thing to tell you, and that is we don't want you making decisions for us just on the basis of you and your children. Our heritage is that our leaders must make decisions for 7 generations yet unborn. When we look back 500 years, we're looking back on generations that made decisions, some good, some bad. But we can analyze those and appreciate them and thank God that we're able to all come here together and celebrate whatever it was that happened in the past. But as we use these messages, as we learn these lessons, and we share them throughout our nation and with the other nations of the world, the so-called American exceptionalism, and I don't like that term particularly, but I do know God has blessed us more than he's blessed any people anywhere on the face of the earth at any time in history. And my grandmama always said, to them to whom much has been given, of them is much required. And so this is not a frivolous carnival. This is really a requirement to analyze our history, to see what are the things we did right, what are the things we did wrong. And our requirement is that we make those lessons available for the peoples all over the world. Because the 87 million people that come here need to learn how we get along. They need to learn how free enterprise and democracy works. For people regardless of color, they need to know how poor people can get educated and become rich people. And they need to know that we have a formula for making it possible for all of God's children to live in peace and prosperity and celebrate and protect the precious environment with which God has endowed us. God has blessed you with this opportunity. Please don't let this harvest pass.